All right, good evening. I appreciate you joining us tonight. For those of you who are at host sites, thanks for doing that. For those of you joining us online, we're going to get started here. We've got 5 presenters tonight. The way this will work is they each have about 10 minutes to go through their presentation, and then we'll have a 5 to 10 minutes for you as guests to ask your questions. So you can either type those in the chat box or come on microphone and ask your questions. This meeting is being recorded tonight, and I will send it out to those who have registered. The link will be sent out tomorrow, so you can go back and review the content. Also, I sent out today, for those of you who registered online, the presentations in terms of PDFs of the slides that are going to be shown tonight. So if you did not receive that for some reason, please shoot me an email, and I will make sure that those get to you. We've got a lot of ground to cover tonight, so Eric, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself and get started with your presentation.
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. First of all, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so I'm Eric Hunt. I'm Assistant Extension Educator of Agriculture Meteorology. So I have statewide responsibility for this here at UNL Extension, and I will get started. Okay, I'm assuming this is sharing.
Yeah, we can hear you, or we can see it good, Eric.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so just to start off, I just want to briefly just talk about the Nebraska Mesonet, anymesonet.unl.edu. This is a great resource to look at current temperatures, wind speed. You also could take a look at the Cattle Comfort Index, and you can take a look at resource precipitation, things like that. This is a new website. There will be a couple of new features coming this summer yet, which some will be a little bit more applicable to crops. But I do think there'll be also some things that will be applicable to rangelands as well. So the first product I want to show you guys is, so the first couple of minutes, I just want to talk about where we are currently, and then I'll talk about where we're maybe going. VegDry combines satellite reflectance, so it combines the vegetation reflectance that we're measuring from satellite and also combines with some precipitation data to try to give a little better look at where we have stress. And VegDry breaks it into croplands and rangelands. So this is all the pixels that are considered rangelands across the U.S. So you notice that a lot of Nebraska, with some of this still not in season, but definitely showing, consider some stress here across the eastern portion of the Sandhills, still some stress in the Panhandle. Again, I don't take VegDry too literally this time of year. I tend to put a little bit more stock in it as we get a little bit later into the season. And once we have things that are out, I think the signal can be sort of affected by other things early in the season. But as we get deeper into the year, vegdry.unl.edu would be a great resource for you guys to go to, just to try to get an idea of how it's depicting rangelands in your area, just to see if that actually is depicting reality on the ground for you. These are soil moisture percentiles. Now, again, these are not actual measured soil moisture. This is a robust model that was from NASA, and this is put into a percentile form. So it's kind of based on early 80s to present. So it's relative to the time of year for a location. So, for example, we are, according to this, very, very dry here across portions of the Sandhills where we've missed out on resource precipitation. Sometimes this model doesn't do quite as well across portions of the Panhandle, Nebraska, getting up in the high plains. I think this is probably a little bit underdone, but generally speaking, we have very dry soils across pretty much the western two-thirds of the state. A little bit better over here in eastern Nebraska, where we have picked up a little bit more precipitation, but we are starting to go the wrong direction again with the kind of general lack of precipitation in this area. This is a look at shallow groundwater percentiles. So again, this shows that according to this, the Panhandle and a lot of the southwestern, south central part of the state is still dealing a lot of shallow groundwater issues. This may be having more of an impact on pastures than I think some of us realize. So I'm just showing this in case this brings up a light bulb for anybody. And this, of course, is the drought monitor, which I'm sure you all know and love. Ha ha. Good news is we have seen some improvement across portions of the Sandhills. So Cherry up into parts of Boyd, Holt counties, Brown Rock counties. There's been some improvement here in the last couple of weeks with recent precipitation. There's still a lot of severe and extreme drought in the Panhandle. I'm not in the perfect agreement with some of the designation down here in the Southwest. I think things are a little bit worse than what's being depicted here. And I don't be surprised if you see some of this here further east and south in the south central and east central section of the state go back over to drought this week. For full disclosure, I do help make the recommendations for the drought monitor. So I lead a team here at UNL. So I work with other people in extension, try to get some feedback from people from the National Weather Service. Not going to get much of that these days with some of the budget issues. But regardless, I do make recommendations to the author. Sometimes they take them, sometimes they don't. As a general rule, if it's borderline on needing degradation or borderline on needing to stay in a worse category, generally I try to ask for that. Don't always get it, but I will say that for those of you that are in the Panhandle, Aaron is a great resource. He's very upfront about the conditions out there, and again, I have the drought. I could talk about the drought monitor for forever, but it's an indicator-driven process. But some indicators can show things are worse than others. And if you all send in impact reports, we can help line up indicators to say, well, this is probably actually a little bit more accurate what's going on, and that can help make an argument to the author for degradation or keeping some level if that is the case. Okay, the CPC says that most of the state is likely to stay in drought through the end of June. Again, if you are in severe or extreme drought, you got a long way to go to get out of drought entirely. I'm a little concerned that some places that are listed at white in the state are maybe going back into by the end of June. We will see. Okay, now I'm going to get to the outlook portion, and I'll just be upfront. Pretty much every signal I'm seeing for the current upcoming late spring into the summer and fall shows dry favored across pretty much the entire state of Nebraska, across most of the Great Plains and the western half of the Midwest, and it also shows warm being favored. I would say with some confidence that, or I would say that I am reasonably confident in both of these coming at least to fruition on some level. I think the bigger question would be, do we get precipitation in the near term? I do think there is a window here the next 2 or 3 weeks where we can get some decent precipitation even into the western portion of the state. Got some rain and snow coming here later this week, Thursday night into Friday. I definitely see chances later in April and into the first part of May for getting some precipitation. But I must say, if you miss out on that, it's probably going to be another 2 or 3 weeks for your next shot at it. And by that point, you're starting to miss out on the climatological best portion of the year for rainfall and or that late season snow. So my concern is that if we miss some of this rain, that things are just going to get worse in some spots. In terms of temperatures, again, June's are getting warmer. That's just, kind of part of our warming planet. July, August haven't been quite as bad here in recent summers. And, again, they're a little bit more bullish on the heat to our west and to our, well off to the northeast of the country. But I would anticipate the summer being warm at times, particularly probably early and late in the season. The European model, they have seasonal outlook. So they put this as what they're expecting for precipitation, temperature. So precipitation on the left, temperature on the right. So again, this is just another data point showing warm and dry favor for pretty much the entire region. Now, the good news is their deficits are not incredibly acute, particularly across portions of the sandhills. So, I mean, there maybe is a silver lining that maybe we might be a little dry, but maybe we aren't going to be super, super dry. And I think that's important because I think if we can get some decent precipitation the next 2 or 3 weeks, then, again, I'm not saying a dry summer is great, but if it's just a little dry after good spring moisture, that's very different than lack of spring moisture and a very dry summer. I do think we are still looking at potential for some warmer temperatures persisting through the late summer and early fall. Again, that would kind of keep with recent tradition of staying pretty warm into September. The analog years for this year, and again, I'm not saying any of these are perfect or gospel, but I think the years that I think are most closely related to this coming summer are 2006, 11, 17, and 21. I think 2022 and 1999 would be other analogs, but I think these 4 are the strongest. So if you take a composite of those 4 years, again, we kind of come out pretty dry across most of this region. So some of the same areas where the forecast is for dry are kind of what the analogs are also saying. From a meteorological perspective, what I am anticipating happening this summer is having a stronger ridge, setting up shop somewhere in the western half to 2/3 of the United States. If it sets up over Seattle or Vancouver or right off the West Coast, then I think that means that certainly the eastern 2/3 of the state will get periodic cold fronts and will have chances of moisture the entire summer, or at least portions of the summer. If it sets up shop over the eastern part of Montana, I think most of the state's going to be it's going to be kind of slim pickings for precipitation for the most part. Definitely going to be kind of warm, so it's be similar like what we had in 2022. And if it sets up over somewhere between Minneapolis and Lake Michigan, then the entire Midwest and Northern Great Plains will have a very bad summer. Right now, I think it would be keeping in line with more recent tradition for it to be kind of between Montana and Seattle. Well, that's to say that's not a wet signal for this region of the country. And I haven't seen anything, in terms of looking at ocean temperatures or projected atmosphere patterns this summer that would lead me to think something very different is going to happen. Not to say that it can't. I mean, that'd be nice if we had a wet summer, but right now that doesn't seem particularly likely. The last slide I want to show is GrassCast. So this is developed in part by UNL, but done in large part with the USDA Northern Plains Climate Hub and Danelle Peck. So she's the one that deserves credit for helping develop this. Now, this is not literally looking at forage production. I think this is like annual net primary productivity, but you can use forage production as a proxy. And what this model does is it assumes current conditions being what they are. And it says, okay, if you have above average precipitation, you could expect, this result, normal precipitation, you can expect this result, and below average. So I wouldn't put a lot of faith in this left figure coming to fruition. Hope for the middle and maybe prepare for the right one, just given the outlook. And given that, realistically, if we were below normal for the rest of the season, it seems probable that most of the state and most of this region will have below average forage production for the upcoming season. So that's my presentation. I will, I don't want to take up too much time presenting, but I do want to leave some time for questions in case you guys have any.
So questions for Eric tonight, you're welcome to come on microphone or put those in the chat box and he can.
Again, but if there's some good news, I do think there's a good chance of moisture coming the next 2 or 3 weeks. I just don't know how continuous that's going to be into late spring, early summer.
How much moisture?
How much? Where are you at?
Sheridan County.
Oh,
Southern Sheridan.
I would say the next 2 weeks you could get upwards of 1.5 inches if at best. I think you should get a quarter to third, maybe 4/10 of an inch later this week.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm not talking about any rains that are going to end the drought, but it would certainly at least help try to get some pastures going. So I know that rainfall in the next month and a half is going to be very critical.
Yes, sir. This is Charlie Singleton. In Southwest Nebraska, and speaking there, I mean, there's a lot of areas, I'm sure, but even if we get 1 inch or 1.5 inches, it's not going to stop what we've got going on. We've got a mess. We've had between 3/4 and 1.4 inches of moisture in the last 7 months. It's not going to, a little bit's not going to fix our problems.
Agreed.
I don't know. My brother submitted multiple deals to the state. I don't even think anybody looks at them and listens anymore.
Who are you guys submitting stuff to? Because I unless I hear from somebody in extension, I don't get feedback on conditions from anybody from the state.
It's CMOR.
Oh, CMOR. Okay. Gotcha.
Does anybody even look at those, or is that just a waste of time? Because we've done multiple, and it doesn't seem like it's changed anything.
I mean, Technically, I think the authors were supposed to take those into consideration. I don't know how often that happens. I will personally try to take a closer look at those.
Okay,
But
thank
I mean,
you.
I would say though that what's probably a better use of your time is contacting your local extension educator and telling them to get, or either just direct contact me directly. Because again, I can't just say pastures are bad, give this area a drought. But if you tell me, especially if you send me some pictures, sometimes there are indicators like veg dry, for example, last year was very, very helpful in getting the northern part of the panhandle degrade a little more quickly because it was showing more stress. Other indicators were not showing that as much. So if you can send me stuff and send me pictures or send your extension educator stuff, that will get up the chain. That's probably a better use of your time, honestly.
Okay, I'd love to do that. I'm pretty sure you can dig to the water table and besides a 4-inch little strip of moisture, you won't find anything. And it's been that way for months.
Mm-hmm.
The wind is what little we have got, the winds took away. We've had 40-mile-an-hour winds damn near every day for 3 weeks.
Yeah, I'll be windy tomorrow too.
Not a surprise.
Yeah, I would just say too, there aren't really any good indicators that deal with soil moisture percentiles that would take the wind into account to a certain degree. But right now, I don't think we have a great way of actually showing surface dryness because of consistent high wind speeds, which I know that's been a huge issue in parts of the state. The other thing that's been a problem out your way, you were very, very warm a lot of the fall. You had very little snow cover for most of the winter. Then, a little bit of snow and a huge freeze in February, then right back to really warm temperatures. So you get these whiplash. So I'm sure that's not healthy for the vegetation.
No.
And,
No,
some of that stuff just kind of gets washed out in indicators.
What is trying to come up, including the winter wheat, you can see the drought in the vegetation, what little bit there is. What moisture there is, I believe, is below the line for a whole lot of that to be able to utilize.
Mm-hmm.
I'll shut up. I'm sorry.
Is there an email we can send?
Yeah, is there an email I can send you stuff on?
Yeah, we'll get it for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? I'll be on here for a little bit if anybody wants to chat with me individually through message. I see I have one.
All right, if there's no other questions for Eric, we'll go ahead and transition. Mitch, we'll let you talk about range and the impact of soil moisture and grass growth.
There we go. Sorry about that, trying to get the audio to work. So I'm just going to talk a little bit tonight about a little bit of some of the history that we've seen, and I'm going to focus a little bit here in the Panhandle. Going to focus a lot more in the Sandhills, basically because we have a lot more data from some of our research ranches in the Sandhills. But I think some of the principles can come across a lot of places here in Nebraska. But really thinking about your plant community, focusing on the domination, if it's dominated by cool season or warm season grasses, or as most of them are, a pretty good mixture of all. When we think about drought in the rangeland profession, this is the textbook response. It's essentially the period without precipitation during which the soil water content is reduced to such an extent that the plants suffer from water. Where we're at now in a lot of places, especially here in the early part of the growing season. And I like to look back. This is data taken from the Scottsbluff Airport. And I really like to look at some of these trends and look at some of these patterns that we've seen over the longer term, because drought's just an inevitable part of our climate. When we really look at this, this is annual precipitation is both the yellow and the gray bars, and so the yellow bars are the May, June, July precipitation. I'm looking at that as some of our most important precipitation as a whole across the state. In the Panhandle here, that's about 48% of our total precipitation on average. And so when we look at total precipitation, we have about 13 years in the last 75 that were below 75% of the normal total annual precipitation based on these numbers. When we look at the gist of the May, June, July precipitation, we see that doubles. And so we have about 26 of those years in the last 75 that are below 75% of the averages here. And so really we look at since about 2002, we've seen some really good years that are well above the 125% of the average. But if we look at the last 4 years here, going back to 2020, we really see that 2020 to 2022, we were below that 75% of normal precipitation for those really important months for growth. 2023, really a good year. We saw a lot of growth, and it felt like a good year after 3 years of it was pretty dry. Last year we were back well below that again, and so we've just been dry for the most of 2024, and that's going to be carrying over here into 2025. This is a standardized precipitation index tool that the University of Arizona puts out. I really like it. It's modeled data, but it does create some neat graphs to look at these historic weather patterns. And so if it's brown and goes toward the negative, that means those drought periods. If it's blue and closer to positive too, that means the really wet periods. And so we did have some pretty good times there, especially in the late teens there, from 2015 all the way up to 2019 was a fairly wet period. As you can see, there's more of those blue bars above there. But then really since 2020, we've dropped back down, 2023 back up, and then we've come back down. But then you look at the early 2000s, and that was really a dry period for us that went on for like 6 or 7 years there, where it was mostly there with the brown bars facing down. And so how does the amount and timing of precipitation influence different plant functional groups in the sandhills? And this is what we've been working on for a number of years. We have several of these exclosure cages that we move around in the spring of every year. So we capture pastures that have been grazed the previous year, and we take these frames that we set down. They're a 1/4 meter square. We clip all the plant materials. We separate it into cool season, warm season grasses, forage shrubs, and sedges as well. And then we convert that to pounds per acre, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about here as some of the data that we've collected. And the first place is at the UNL Barber Brothers Ranch, and that's just over in Brown and Rock County there, right on the border. And this is the last 3 years of precipitation that we've seen there. And so the lines show the accumulated precipitation over the year, and then the bars will show the amounts of precipitation we got in each of the months. And so the orange bar is our average, and the orange with the blue diamonds is the average accumulation that we see. And so 2022 really never took off. You see, it's well below average. It really was a low producing year, and I'll show that here in a minute. In 2023, though, we really saw a bump, and we really saw that bump in June and July, and so it really kind of put things. A lot of those warm season grasses that really helped with that precipitation in June and July there. Last year we had a really good April, May and June were all looking pretty good, and then we just shut off precipitation in this area. You see the green line really just flatlined the rest of the year, and has flatlined through into 2025. So we're starting looking more like 2022, with the lower amounts of precipitation in general for this area. And so this is what the plant production looked like. And so this is what we've clipped over the years since 2001. And so the solid line is where our total plant production average is. The dotted line is where our grass production average is, and that's warm season, cool season grasses and sedges. And so when we looked at this, is that 6 of the years, and that was 2001, 2002, 2006, 2012, 2017, and 2022 were below that 75% of the total plant and grass production. The lowest year was in 2002, where we had only 42% of average grass production over this whole period during that time. And really that 2002 was because we saw multiple years of dry conditions. That's really when we see a lot of the effect on some of this grass production throughout Nebraska. And what's interesting also with this graph is if you look at the blue bars, the blue sections of those bars, these are our cool season grasses. And you can see that along with the red ones, but cool season grasses tend to be quite susceptible to some of these dry periods, and they tend to respond more in the year after a drought, really get hit hard in a year of a drought, and then that tends to last for a few years afterwards. And so when we look at years like 2002, where it's dropped down, even though 2022, 2023 was a little bit better precipitation, that didn't come till later. So we've kind of stayed fairly low in our cool season grasses and fluctuated a little bit more in our warm season grasses. But quite complex plant community, and when we look at the highs and the lows, we're looking at about 3 times difference in the grass production between 2002 and our high in 2019 there. So this is just another way of looking at that data. This is total plant production, and on the bottom x-axis there, it's May, June, July precipitation, both the days with at least 1/10 of an inch of precipitation, as well as the accumulated precipitation. And both of these models explain this data and pretty well, a lot of the variability. But as you can see, the 2024 was a little bit above that dashed line, meaning that it did better than what our models would have predicted that it would have in 2024. And I think a lot of that was because we had good precipitation early, and then July was really dry, so it didn't show that it had as much precipitation in that time period. But really what these lines say is that in this plant community, we should get about 76 pounds more for every day we get 1/10 of an inch precipitation, or in the other graph, every inch that we get, we should get about 92 pounds more per acre, depending on which of the models that you use. And then we jump over here to the UNL Goodmanson Sandhills Lab near Whitman, Nebraska there. And we've been working on a similar data set that was started in 2004 there. And, we've seen some interesting things in this data set as well, but generally speaking, we see a similar pattern with the amount of precipitation. The bars that you see here show the variability between the years. And so the blue are what we collected in mid-June, and this is the percent of the total plant production. So mid-June, we tend to see more cool season grasses at that time. In mid-August, we see more warm season grasses, but we did see some interesting things like those diamonds for Forbes showed that in 2013, the year after 2012, most people remember that drought year, our Forbes accounted for 50 and 60% of our total biomass the year after. And there's some kind of interesting reasons for that. But the research that we've just been publishing recently on this has really shown that, our warm season grasses, they're going to rely on that current year summer conditions, and that's really how they function. But our cool season grasses have more of an effect of the previous year. So if we have a good fall, or even earlier in the year of the previous year, there tends to be some residual effects into that subsequent year on the cool season grasses. Same with drought. If there's drought the previous year, cool season grasses the following year usually reduce. The opposite is true for Forbes. If we have dry conditions in this year, next year we'll typically see a little bit more Forb production. And then when you add all these together for our plant production, it makes it pretty complex because there tends to be winners and losers depending on when that precipitation falls. This was at the Goodmanson Sandhills Lab as well. This shows how in 2013 we just saw a tremendous amount of annual sunflowers and lamb's quarter and other annual Forbs that came about. Some research in the Sandhills recently that talked about it. They found in this that in the 2012 drought, increase some of the available soil nitrates, reduce the amount of perennial grasses. And so the following year really created good scenarios when the rainfall did come, that those annual forbs and really took advantage of that extra nitrogen and the precipitation. And so just thinking about where our carbohydrate reserves are for grasses right now, this would be in a normal year where there's normal growth. We typically see in the spring, this would be for a cool season, but if warm seasons might be moved over just a little bit more into the late spring and summer. But reserves drop as that plant is growing, but it doesn't take too many leaves before that photosynthesis really takes off, and that plant's able to store more of those carbohydrates for use. And so, but when droughts hit, especially some of these early droughts, really that growth of that plant stunted, and that really affects the carbohydrate reserves. And so this is where I look at those multiple years. If we see that, that's usually where we start to see the plant mortality, reduced growth, and other problems that happen as a result of it. Fewer reproductive tillers, fewer reproductive bud formations, and then some of the other shifts in plant community can also happen. And so when we think about our grazing management, this is a lot of times I show this picture. This was John Weaver, who was in the 50s, ecologist, really showing that the stronger that we can keep our plants as far as our grazing management, that persistent high intensity grazing is really going to reduce those root reserves, and then add that on top of drought. That's really going to affect our ability for that plant community to bounce back following when the rains do come. And then this is Dijkstra Hughes, who is with the Soil Conservation Service, the predecessor of the NRCS. He was a really early range scientist, and he often talked about drought and talked about the need to have a strong plant community and its ability to withstand these droughts more. I believe most of our plant communities are fairly resilient. They know the drills. We look back, they've seen these drought and wet cycles, but how we manage becomes really important for it to come back after some of these. But I think thinking after the drought is really just important as well as thinking during the drought. And so with that, I'll wrap that up, and I'll just open it up to any questions, either here or online.
Mitch, when we look at how dry it was last year, even if we had average precip this, what are we looking at in terms of forage production compared to a long-term average?
Yeah, I think it can be variable across the state. I think here in the Panhandle, we're going to be a little low. I think last year, we got a little bit of a bump from 2023. At least some of our data here in the Panhandle would suggest that. But it's just been so dry here. Same in the sand hills, like at the Barr Brothers Ranch. I just think it shut off so quickly in July that's going to carry over into the current year. Now, it can be turned around pretty quick if we get some good precipitation, but I do still think even if we got it, it's probably going to be a little bit below what we'd normally see, especially with some of those cool season grasses.
Should we be looking into some sort of a lick tub scenario if we are somebody who has a lot of standing grass, but it's all dead? I understand that that's not ideal and it is expensive, but it's better than selling off all your cattle.
Yeah, I think last year it grew really fast, really early in the year, and then towards the end of the year when it got so dry, the quality really dropped out of it. And in some drier years, you might see some of that quality kind of hang on, not producing quite as much structural carbohydrates in some of those grasses that are out there. But yeah, extending out, if you have a lot of forage, but it just doesn't have the quality, I think that can help, in some sort of supplementation. I think Karla is probably going to talk more about that as we go.
Okay. Well, if we do go down that route, is there any real detriment or damage to if the pastures don't take on and you start eating a lot of dead grass, your pastures are going to look overpressured. Is that going to affect the root system as much as it would otherwise?
I think it can during the growing season. Yeah, I mean, in the dormant season, most of those carbohydrates have already pulled down into the reserves. But in during the growing season, I do think that
I think we lost Mitch.
sorry, it did shut down on me. I think we're back now, but yeah, I mean, I do think that the combination of heavy grazing and drought, it can affect those grasses that are out there. I mean, it's probably one of the big things, because even if it can put on some, and then go dormant, it still produces some of that photosynthesis. And so if you take that away for a full year, I think that's really where you start to see some problems. Combination of heavy grazing and drought. Yeah.
Mitch, as we think about cool season dominated rangeland and warm season, what are some trigger dates as far as precip and needing to make some decisions as we look at the next 2 months?
Yeah, I think, I think as Eric kind of pointed out, I think that the next few weeks are going to be pretty important for those cool season grasses. I think this is really where, I look at about mid-May as a trigger point. If we haven't had good precipitation by then, the likelihood that it's going to really put a lot of biomass on those cool seasons, especially if a dry year last year. And then for the warm season grasses, I'm usually looking at mid to late, about a month later. We've seen, like in 2017, for example, we had a dry period from late May to mid July, and even though we had good precipitation on either end of that for those warm season grasses, that was such a critical point during that period. Then we didn't see rainfall, that we really didn't see a recovery of those warm season grasses in that current year. And so yeah, I mean, I think pretty critical here in this May-June period. June's probably our most important month if you're heavily warm season, and then May here would be your most important month for cool season.
Mitch, do you have numbers from Goodmanson or Barta Brothers on maybe the last year, how much production's been lost?
So we were pretty close to average this year, just a little bit below average for Barta Brothers and Goodmanson there.
Other questions for Mitch?
Given where we are right now, how many cows, what percentage of the cows would you not run? I mean, everybody's got some they could sell, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really tough to say. If I had a crystal ball and was able to say, how this will turn around and where we'll be. I mean, if we just started getting good precipitation, as Eric kind of showed with grass cast, we could get close to that average, amount of production this year. But it's really, if we don't get good May, June precipitation this year, then I think you need to start thinking of those considerations. Now, if you want to be more conservative on it, and it was really dry last year, then it might not hurt to start earlier to find some other options for those animals here at a certain percentage, right? And so it varies depending on what it looked like in your area, how much residual feed you have, those types of things. And so it's hard to put an exact amount on those, but if it was dry last year, you grazed it a little bit harder, you want to give it a little bit of recovery, then now's a good time to think about 5-10%. If you're not getting the rainfall you want in May and June, then you can make deeper cuts at that time too.
All right, thanks, Mitch. I think Jerry will go ahead and transition to you to talk about some annual forages.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Just one more thought on that range production. There used to be an old train of thought that when you get to the end of April, and this is only applies to the sand hills, when you get to the end of April and you're digging your post hole 3, even 4 feet deep, you look at how much moisture is in that sand. And well, the thought used to be that if it was dry, you're going to be in a world of hurt at the end of April. But I've seen years where it may have been very dry at the end of April, that soil, the sand, but with some early May rain and in the sand, that soil profile really fills up pretty fast just because of the good infiltration of the sand. So just I like to be an optimist and hold out till the very latest. So here, annual forages, of course, ideally in these situations we're talking about could be under both irrigation or dryland situations. I think if we're dryland, I think Eric Hunt was pretty confident and bold in some of his predictions as far as knowing when and how much rain we could get. So you might check with him when you're thinking about doing some planting on some of these annuals in the dryland case. So first of all, we've got the cool season spring ones used. Typically, it's oats primarily here in Nebraska, spring triticale, spring barley, a few other things. But we are basically kind of at the end of the window on that cool season cereal grain planting. We are, of course, it's April 15th. We could still plant, but the later you plant these cool season annuals, the lower the production is going to be. And particularly once if we get into May and we see some 90-degree days, that really just causes those cereal grains to try to mature, slow down growing. And so it's usually the earlier the better. And just some photos here of late March planted ones here in North Platte, a variety of different things. And these would be in about the third week of June in this picture when a person would be typically haying those. Just some production we've seen over the years. We've done a lot of spring trials and summer trials, but anywhere 3 to 4 tons. And one of the things I've noticed, whether it's an oats, or spring triticale, or spring barley, there's no consistent pattern as far as to me which one's the best. Some years the oats seems to be do better than the spring triticale and vice versa. So all pretty similar. Of course, with our summer annuals, we've got the different groups, including the millets, the sorghum Sudan hybrid sorghum, straight Sudan grass, a few other less common things like the crabgrass, teff, corn, or several legumes. For those summer annuals or warm season annuals, mid to late May, they like those warm soil temperatures. You want to be at that 60 to 70 degree soil temperature. Seeding rates, even with some of the same things, such as a sorghum Sudan hybrid, different varieties have different seed sizes. So to get the right seeding rate, you probably really check with the variety that you have. Maybe your seed supplier has some information on what's best for that. In general, I got a table or a slide here with the best uses of summer annual forages. Okay, so all of them, of course, could be hayed, but some stand out better with one thing or another. So, for example, if grazing is going to be our main objective, I think you want to look towards the Sudan grass or pearl millet. Some of the other ones specifically for hay, obviously foxtail millet is probably going to be the one that is best suited for hay. And so kind of have in mind what you might want to be doing with that summer annual forage in terms of which one you should select based on your different conditions. Now, probably of all of these, your foxtail millets are the most drought tolerant, if you will, or in other words, can produce the most forage with the least amount of rain. Okay. And the reason for that is, well, they're relatively more shorter growing, but shorter in stature, but also in 45 to 50 days from planting, you got a crop that's ready to harvest. In general, production from each of these different groups kind of looks like this. Again, this varies from year to year depending on some of the conditions. The things like the foxtail millet or, of course, the teff are less than those taller growing Sudan grass or forage sorghum type of varieties. Now, I mentioned the planting date starting in late May. That doesn't necessarily hold true for everything. You can plant these much later. Here's just some example here where this is a July 11th seeding. And this photo is 48 days later in late August. And we've got a teff on the left, white wonder foxtail millet in the middle, and a sorghum Sudan hybrid on the right in this plot here. Then also another one, a late July seeding, and 48 days later on September 13th, we've got the same thing here, teff left, white wonder foxtail millet, and sorghum Sudan. So even at those later seeding dates, you can produce quite a bit of forage. And this is just some of the tonnage numbers from those different plot trials that we did. But then, of course, the other possibility, if we're looking at fall forage, anything that the cool seasons like the oats or barley, spring triticale, they can be planted again in late July through at least mid-August for a fall crop grazing, or in some cases hay. But usually when we're looking at this time period, trying to make hay in September or October to early November is pretty difficult. So it's mostly for grazing. And here's an example of some different spring cereal grains planted in August 13th and 2012, a little bit older data. This is irrigated, of course, because we wouldn't have grown anything in 2012 in late summer. But for 3 to 4 tons per acre, very good productivity from these by the end of October. And so about 70 to 75 days for things like oats and spring triticale or barley is what you need as far as planting to harvest. If you were grazing these, this is a hay harvest simulation, but grazing and you planted in mid-August, by late September, you're easily 8 to 10 inches tall and could be grazing some of these. Some other things that we've done that you could do or think about too is mixing some of the winter and non-winter hardy cool season species. So by that I mean winter rye and oats. So you're planting these in late summer, and the idea here is that the oats is going to produce much more growth in the fall than that rye will. And the oats, of course, will winter kill out, but you will still have the rye there for growth in the following spring. So basically it's one planting operation, but kind of doubling where you might have some grazable forage. And just another photo here, some rye and turnips in late September, rye and oats in early August, and mostly what you're seeing is the oats. And again, for these fall forages with the cool seasons, my general rule of thumb is you want to be about mid-August, no later than mid-August in that planting of these to have adequate time for growth in the fall forage production. So photo here, foreground is an August 13th planting, but in the background is a late September 21st planting. And there's just not going to be enough time to get very much growth out of those before the season ends. So cool season by September 1st, and then warm seasons, like I say, you can go all the way up to, I think, even August 10th. And this would be central Nebraska to produce some good fall forage. Grazing of these annuals can be a little tricky for most people. They get away, those tall growing ones, get away from them. They strip leaves, trample a lot. So key things, I think, start at the appropriate stage or height. And it varies for some of those different ones, like Sudan grass, for example. I think when it's 18 to 20 inches tall, you better get out there with those cattle and start grazing it. Some simple rotations can work pretty well too. We do have some estimates of what the carrying capacity and how much you could stock it. And so this would be things like the spring cool season, spring annuals, or if you had winter wheat, rye from last fall. And if you estimate your tonnage about 2.5 tons per acre, if it were hay, which should be no problem, that means you should be able to run about a pair and a half per acre for 1.5 months. So, or 1.4 to 1.4 pairs for 1.5 months. So kind of a range there. And similarly for those summer annuals, you might be up in this 4 or even 5 ton per acre production with those. But your grazing management is going to have to be on top of the game. And, you're looking anywhere from a pair per acre for 3 months, and depending on when you start and how long you plan to go. And lastly, for the fall growing cool seasons, it's also very similar. You probably got a 2-month window there of grazing, but at the very conservative 2.5 tons per acre, that's a pair per acre easy for that 2-month period. So, of course, with any of the annuals, we think about nitrates as a potential issue. Table here lists some of the different ones. We got either high or medium risk or accumulating potential. So under high, the sorghum Sudan, the sorghum hybrids, the cereal grains, things like oats, barley, they still can produce nitrates or can accumulate nitrates, but it's a little less potential than a sorghum. Our typical cover crop things like the turnips and radishes and sugar beets and so on are more medium. Some of the other grain type of crops, corn, amaranth, pearl millet, foxtail can also be in the high category. So with that, I'll try to keep on time, on schedule, and take a few questions.
That your production numbers were for central Nebraska. So if we move that out to central Panhandle, how much would we be decreasing those production numbers?
For things like the cool season ones, not much at all. Like in that Alliance area, there's a lot of guys grow triticale, whether it's for silage or haylage or even just hay. And from some of those guys, some of their production can be quite good. And for the summer annuals, yeah, you might be anywhere from I don't know, I guess 10 to 20% less in terms of production. There's certain things like pearl millet, for example. It really likes the hot weather. If they're growing that down in Oklahoma or East Texas, they can get some tremendous production from it just because it really likes that hot weather.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We predominantly feed oats and silage, and we do have some low meadows that has been used for some farm ground.
Mm-hmm.
It's only about, there's water standing in there right now. It's technically considered swamp country, so the root system gets established. They do have access to some moisture, but it's a limited space. The biggest proponent for our growth, because we run yearland, so obviously we background everything all winter, is oats. On a year like this, should we be not planting corn there? Should we be planting oats?
Oh. And so you're talking about this almost sub-irrigated wet ground?
Correct.
That's going to dry up pretty quickly, right? Or typically, right?
Typically it will. It will dry up. Yes.
Yeah. My only concern would be, if you're still planting the oats now here, which you can do, it's mid-April. Your productivity and growing window for it is a little short because, like I say, once it gets hot, that really tends to stunt it, tries to make it go mature much quicker. And so you'll still get a fair amount. But your other options, you said you do sometimes plant corn in that?
Yes, it's a alfalfa field that was planning on being transitioned to a
Ah,
cornfield for rotation.
yeah.
But the biggest growth, the most nutrients we get out of our feed is oats.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, and there's no doubt too that if you did plant oats, that little bit less yield in oats with 70 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer is going to be some pretty high quality stuff if you cut it in June 15th or June 25th, something right in there. Yeah.
So I guess my question is, um, would you, in your opinion, it's going to be oats on drier country, corn on the sub-irrigated, or would you just do the oats on the sub-irrigated? And because that's the base for our backgrounding operation for our yearlings.
Yeah. I don't know. I think I might still spread that risk a little bit and do both. Do oats on the uh, currently drier pieces of ground, and then the corn, some corn on the wetter sites.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
There's no more questions for Jerry. Karla, we'll go ahead and transition to your presentation.
Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Now you're in full presentation mode and we can hear you well.
Okay, great. Okay, I am Karla Wilke. I'm the cow-calf stocker management specialist out here in the Panhandle. And I am going to give you a bird's eye view, and hopefully we're going to talk about everything you ever wanted to know about feeding production cows and confinement in 10 minutes. So feeding pairs is different than feeding pregnant, non-lactating cows. That's something all of us are pretty familiar with because most of us in the wintertime have to supplement our dry pregnant cows. But what we're talking about now is feeding them at a time that they would normally be getting all their nutrient needs met out on grass. So there's three big things that we have to think about if we're going to do any kind of confinement feeding. And one is that we have got to meet the energy demands of lactation, which are tremendously more than just gestation. They have got to have a decent body condition status for rebreeding. And then we've got to account for the dry matter intake of the calf. We often think of the cow supporting the calf, which she does. But in addition to nursing the cow, that calf out there on the pasture is starting to eat some green grass. And if we don't have them out there, then that calf's intake is not going to be accounted for there. So I made this graph of a mature cow to kind of help us visualize some things. The gray bars are TDN or total digestible nutrients, and the red bars are crude protein. And so it just shows you that once that cow goes into lactation, that her nutrient needs are quite a bit higher than they were in the winter before that calf was born. And when we're able to go to green grass in June and they're grazing along, that will actually, if they can eat that ad libitum and there's plenty there, that actually meets their needs for early lactation. If we were to just feed some meadow hay and increase the amount of distillers we were feeding, you'd see that in there in the middle there between the early lactation and the June grass doesn't meet her needs and would therefore, without going on to grass, would cause her to take the energy reserves out of her body condition to then meet those energy needs for lactation. So she would begin to lose fat deposition. The problem with that is that there is a lot of data going clear back to 1986, and what I'm showing you here is actually some more recent data from 2021. Same story for all those years, is that when we have cows in a body condition score less than a 5 on a 1 to 9 scale, they do not breed. If that's what their body condition score is at calving, they do not breed back as well as the cows that are in a 5 or greater at calving. And so in this particular graph, they show fixed AI time, the natural service, and then the overall total cows that calved. And the little asterisks tell you that that is a significant difference in the amount of cows that got bred, whether they were carrying decent condition. And if we are going to not go out to pasture and they're not going to have any chance to make up any condition that they might lose between calving and going to grass, then we have got to meet those needs nutritionally in what we feed them. So in case you're thinking, I don't know what a 5 or a 6 is on a 1 to 9 scale, this cow would be in about a body condition score 5. This cow would be in a 6. And so basically what we're talking about is that we're keeping them in moderate condition. They're not thin and not really fat. So then the next question becomes, well, do you have to have a mixer wagon and bunks to feed in confinement? Technically, no. Certainly helps, makes it easier. And if I'm the nutritionist trying to help you put together the rations, makes it a lot easier for me, but that doesn't mean that it has to be done that way. We can use a sacrifice pasture or an area of a pasture that we sacrifice to have our feeding ground on. We can feed hay or residues and then supplement on top of that, or we can feed a total mixed ration if you do have access to those mixers and things. Another option is to use crop residue, fallow ground, pivot corners, whatever that you can creatively figure out how to do that. But the important thing to remember is that the feeding space during that feeding time needs to be about 2 foot per cow and 1 for the baby calf, or the young calf, I should say. Then the positive thing of being able to do this on crop ground or somewhere like that is that it does allow you to spread that out enough that we don't have a lot of issues with boss cows and that kind of thing. You can really spread it out more than you can if you're confined to feedlot pens. The downside is waste that you might encounter on the ground. So let's talk about that nursing calf real quick. That baby calf that is nursing will eat about 1.5% of his body weight in forage dry matter intake. This data shows forage intake on an organic matter basis, and it just basically shows you that as he grows, he eats more and more pounds of feed. And so we need to account for that when we're putting together a diet for the pairs. Then we need to take into account how much of that the calf is probably eating to make sure that we meet his needs as best we can. And then we're not shorting the cow and she's not losing body condition, which is very important for rebreeding. So I just put together this lactation diet for pairs for an example. And so I used ground residue, wet distiller's grains, triticale silage, corn silage, and some mineral. I'm expressing this as a percent of dry matter and then percent as is. So that's the percentages that actually go into your mixture, taking into account the moisture in the feeds, which for the distillers and the silages is quite a bit. Then the other thing that I wanted to show you was that I put some numbers to it. You could put your own numbers to it as far as a pounds per ton of commodity that you'd be using. But when I put that on a daily basis and then I added a yardage charge for having to go out there and feed them every day, it might surprise you to find that it's just a little more expensive than a lot of pasture that you would lease. And a couple of hidden costs to pasture lease is the trucking, getting the cattle there and back if you can't trail them there, and then the wear and tear on your vehicle going and checking them. So keep that in mind when you start comparing your options. But this diet would meet the nutrient demands of the pair. This might be another example of one where if you didn't have access to wet distillers, but you were maybe on the eastern side of the state and you could get soybean meal and corn, we could do that too. We could put together a diet. There's probably as many different options for diets as there are people on this webinar. So at this point, I just want to put in a plug for all the beef-focused educators and specialists with UNL across the state, and we are there to help producers put together rations if they need to do this for a drought scenario. So some of you may be thinking, I don't have a mixer. I can't afford to have somebody come grind. I don't, none of that you've talked about is going to work for me. I've also had people, tip bales on end, pour molasses over them, soak them pretty good to get the cows to where they would eat the poor quality hay without having to run it through a grinder. And then they would feed supplemental cake with it. That's a possibility, maybe. Rolling out wheat straw bales. I have a guy that does that. It definitely works better than corn stalk bales because they'll sort those pretty bad. And then supplementing distillers in a buck. The key is that you have got to, whatever it is you're going to do, you have got to meet the energy demands of lactation. That is the thing. Another option might be if you're in the sandhills and you have medium quality hay, you could feed some dried distillers and corn, and we could come up with a diet that would meet the needs of that pair. The thing is, you got to put that cost of that feed against the value of that pair and compare that to a pretty good cull cow market right now. Minerals and vitamins for confinement are a little different than when you're out on grass. If you're using a lot of distillers for this type of thing, it's high in sulfur, and that's an antagonist for copper. So you need more copper, and you need a very highly available source of copper in the mineral. Our research has shown that those lactating cows in confinement need a pretty healthy dose of magnesium in the mineral. If those cows are going through a drought and they've already been through a long winter, whatever, they are not going to get vitamin A out of the grass. And so you need you need a mineral that has that higher level in it. A lot of commercially available mineral packages are designed to be fed out on grass, which you are not going to be. So you need to think about that. Lastly, really quick, we'll talk about what about creep feeding the calf. So we did some research with some fall-born calves, and we either early weaned at 100 days of age, or the other two groups stayed with the cow for up to 200 days of age. So the treatment that says pairs there, the calves had to get their feed in with the cow's feed, and they just kind of had to compete with the cows. The early wean got their own diet, and the creep fed calves got the same diet that the early weaned calves got, but they had a adjoining pen to the cow where it was a vertical creep gate, and they could go through there and eat it. That diet was alfalfa hay, corn, and distillers, and so it was not a commercial creep feed mix. It was another diet similar to what the cows were on, which was low quality roughages and distillers to meet their needs. And so what this shows you is that during that nursing phase, that first 200 up to 200 days of age there, the calves that were on the creep feed had greater gain than the other two groups. And when we did a 90-day growing phase, then after everybody was weaned, after all the calves were weaned, if you look at the July weight down there at the bottom in bold, you see that those calves that had been on the creep feed as a nursing calf maintained an advantage over the other two groups through that growing phase. And when we put economics to it, it was the same thing, that they still maintained that advantage. The thing that you need to think about though is if you're thinking about doing that with commercial creep feed, you probably better do some math on it, because those tend to be expensive. You're paying a convenience tax to have those pelleted and possibly bagged up. Some people just really can't, they don't have a way to do like a creep gate or whatever, so that's really not an option. They can't do two diets, or they don't want to do two diets, one for the cow and another one for the calves. So if that's not an option for you, these calves actually were in a confinement situation where they got fed with their mom, and then there was a 90-day weaning period after that, and they had a mixture of millet hay, wet distillers, and silage, two different silages in their mineral, and that does help those calves to kind of even out and do pretty well for sale day. So to wrap that up, the key is to meet the nutrient requirements of that cow for lactation. We have to do that. We have to keep that cow in a moderate body condition score to get her rebred, and then we have to account for the feed intake of the calf. And that is my presentation.
All right, questions for Karla?
What I'm anticipating a long, hard summer again. What in our mineral should we be buying in terms of percentage wise? You said vitamin A, but what types of mineral, or maybe what should we be looking for in our mineral package to ensure that they breed back? And what kind of hay should we be feeding right now that we're in the middle of calving to ensure that their body condition is adequate to produce milk and also be in a good condition to go out to a really rough, dry pasture for what I'm considering not a very good summer.
Yeah. So depending on how big your cows are and
There are 1,500-pound Herefords at a score of 5,
okay.
some of them 4.
Okay, so they could actually put on a little weight. It wouldn't hurt them to do that. So that particular cow right before calving probably has a requirement of anywhere from 14 to 15 pounds of TDN per day. So that's the total pounds of TDN that she would need to consume. So you figure out this is what my hay is and this is what my supplement is, and when I feed this many pounds of the feed, it's got to work out to that. For her to go into lactation, then she's going to need that's got to go up to about 17 to 19. And then if you start thinking about that calf eating that, then you've got to, that whole diet's got to go up from there. So it isn't so much which quality of hay. It's kind of like testing your hay, seeing what you have, and then how much supplement do you have to get her up to those levels. See what I'm saying? Like you got to get her up to that level of intake of those nutrients per day. And so it just depends on the hay you have and what supplement you can have. I know you made a comment about lick tubs, and so I just want to bring that up since they only gave me 10 minutes and have time to cover this, but you gave me a good segue into this, so let me say this, that the lick tubs people use to provide a source of nitrogen for the bacteria so that they can do a better job of digesting the poor quality of feed that's out there. But when that cow goes into lactation, she has got to have energy, and there's no way that just eating on that lick tub is enough. She can't just go out there and take on more of that poor quality forage because she ate some nitrogen from that lick tub. You've got a limitation there now, that you've got to provide something else that provides energy for her. So plus the lick tubs usually are designed to be limited in how much they can eat. So you got to keep that in mind too. The other thing that you asked about was the minerals, and it depends a little bit. If you're feeding a lot of distillers, there's phosphorus in that, so you don't need that in the mineral. In our confinement cow mineral, we have 400,000 international units per pound in it, which just seems kind of high, but if they're not going to ever go out on grass, we got to kind of do that. So,
well, these are cows that are they're in a 100-acre pasture right now, calving out. They're getting, 2% body weight of hay a day. It's mostly millet and alfalfa, some oats hay, not very much. And right now they're calving up good. Calves seem to be growing. Better years, they're a little bigger. But right now they still seem to be growing, and the cows seem to be lactating all right. The ones that aren't, I put that towards genetics more than anything else based on records. The biggest thing I'm running into is concerns with being able to breed back. I wish I had more oats hay. And being able to lactate enough to where those calves are not going to come in to weaning time and not be any good.
right.
So what in my mineral package, being that they're just going to go out to pasture with a bull, what my mineral package should I be looking for this summer?
Well, if they're short on energy, your mineral package won't fix that. So, there's
Well, okay, then what should I do to supplement that? And I'm not saying that I am going to be short on it, but I guess
right.
both sides of it.
So, for example, if you had, let's just say you had hay that was 50% TDN, and on a dry matter basis, they're eating 28 pounds of that. Well, that's 14 pounds of TDN, so that's not meeting their needs for lactation. So your grass has got to be, better than that. So your grass may be 60, but what Mitch has been sharing with you is that that you may not have the amount of that grass out there. And so you've got to kind of figure, okay, well, if she, let me grab a calculator here. If she needs 18 pounds of TDN and the grass is 60%, she's got to be able to eat 30 pounds of dry matter of that feed. So do you have that much grass out there per cow to meet that? So that's what you're going to have to kind of figure out, is what is your carrying capacity going to be, and what's the quality of that grass going to be? And if it's not going to be there, do you have some access to some dried distillers or some soy hulls or some other things, depending on where you're located? Is there something you could supplement to get that up to that level?
Okay. And as far as the mineral package, I mean, we generally do just a low grade 8 phos, standard run of the mill, what you get down at your co-op. So in terms of being able to breed back.
Yeah. The phosphorus in that may be fine. I don't know what their vitamin A content is. You might check that, and you probably need to check the content of the copper in it, and the type of it, because you're going to probably want like a copper sulfate or copper chloride, not a copper oxide. Those are not very available. And sometimes those minerals have pretty low copper in them. So you may need to evaluate that too, because you may be short on some of those things in your grass. So
yeah, this is just north of the Sandhills, western Nebraska.
Yeah. So you may want to, sometimes you can do a commercial mineral actually cheaper than you can do some of their things that they already have available. So you might check into that too.
Okay. But basically you're saying we need to make sure that we've got a good copper source, particularly copper sulfate.
Or chloride. And
or chloride.
Yeah, and a vitamin A source. And if your phosphorus is H, you're probably okay. But yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you. We're in for a long haul, so we got to get around it.
Yes. Bethany, does your group have a question?
My lactating cows are getting a good quality meadow hay. I confess I didn't get it analyzed, but it's has a lot of clover and warm season grasses in it. And but I was feeding cattle cubes earlier, but I ran out of them. And so, but I do have access to distillers out of Atkinson that's modified. Could if I would top dress with, I do have a way of, with an old manure spreader to spread distillers on top of the hay after I spread it out. Would that maybe meet Because I am concerned that particularly some of my younger mama cows are a little thin. Probably got a lot of fours there. So thinking about trying to get them in condition to breed back here. I'll be turning the bull out in June or around 1st of June. And so maybe delaying turning out to pasture with the drought here. I'm looking at maybe not trying to keep them around home longer. So hang them longer than what I would like to.
Right. And the wet distillers or the modified is a great way to increase both the energy and the protein needed for those cows. So Bethany can help with that. I can help with that, but we can kind of, sit down and look at some of those. How many pounds would I need of each of these or whatever to do that? And so, yeah, we can do that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Any other quick questions for Karla? All right, Laura, I think we'll transition to you and let you talk about the different programs that are available through FSA and NRCS related to drought.
Good evening. I'm Laura Baker. I am with the Farm Service Agency. I am the County Executive Director out of the Kimball County office. First off, I am going to review some programs, but I want you to remember that your local office is going to be your best bet for information, and they are there and ready and willing to help you with anything. So this just kind of shows our footprint across the state of Nebraska. If you go to farmers.gov, up in the right-hand corner, there is a service center button, and that can help you locate your nearest FSA office as well as your NRCS offices. So this is kind of the scope of what we have available for programs. But for this evening, we're going to focus on disaster assistance. So the first one we're going to touch on is the Livestock Forage Program, or LFP. So this is going to make payments to eligible livestock producers who have eligible grazing lands that have suffered a grazing loss due to a qualifying drought during the normal grazing period for the county. We do use the Drought Monitor as a program trigger for this. So D2 for 8 consecutive weeks during the grazing period, or D3 anytime during the grazing period will trigger that. For Nebraska, for LFP, our grazing period begins April 15th. So today, this is obviously last week's Drought Monitor, and we will get a new one out on Thursday that will tell us where we're sitting with this program in each county across the state. So eligible livestock would be grazing animals. They must have been or would have been grazing eligible. Livestock must have been or would have been on grazing eligible land during the normal grazing season, which starts April 15th. And then they have to have been owned, leased, purchased, or entered into a contract to purchase, or held by a contract grower during the 60 days prior to the beginning date of the qualifying drought. They must have been maintained for commercial purposes. So livestock, that means livestock that contribute to the farm. So working horses would qualify. Feedlot animals are not eligible, and mitigated livestock can become a consideration for multi-year drought locations. The monthly payment factor is based on the drought intensity ratings for each county during the normal grazing season. So for D2 of 8 consecutive weeks, we would have a 1-month payment factor. Anytime we hit D3 in a county, we would go to a 3-month payment factor. If we have D3 for 4 weeks or D4 at any time, we would have a 4-month payment factor. And D4 for 4 weeks would equate to a 5-month payment factor. The Beginning dates for drought might be different for different eligible forage types due to the different grazing seasons. So native grass versus grazing a annual crop such as wheat or rye. So the deadline for an application for payment is March 1st of the following year. So if we're looking at 2025 LFP, you would have until March 1st of 2026 to apply for that program. Let's talk a little bit about emergency assistance for livestock, honeybees, and farm-raised fish, or ELAP. This can provide some financial assistance to eligible producers of livestock, honeybees, farm-raised fish when losses are tied to an eligible adverse weather event, and those losses are not covered by other programs. So this can cover all types of disasters, blizzards, floods, lightning, wildfire, etc. We can use this for drought, but only under certain provisions. These to be eligible, livestock must be grazing animals for commercial production. Feedlot animals are not covered under this program. Livestock must be owned, cash leased, purchased, under contract for purchase, or been raised by a contract grower during the 60 calendar days prior to the beginning date of the eligible adverse weather or loss condition. They must be physically located in the county where the adverse weather occurred. This also has a March 1 of the following year is the deadline for an application for payment. So a couple of different programs we have under ELAP would be transporting livestock feed above normal or transporting the livestock to the feed. So we can reimburse producers for 60% of the feed transportation costs above what they normally would have incurred in a year. These payment formulas will exclude the first 25 miles for that hay hauling and distances above 1,000 miles. The cost formula uses $6.60 per mile. This is prior to that percentage being applied. And please note that is the 2024 rate. We do not have the 2025 rate announced yet. So we'll have to see for sure what that is. This is a self-certification program, but producers should be retaining receipts and documentation when applying. Purchasing feed above normal, additional cost of purchasing additional feed above normal quantities to require to maintain that eligible livestock during an adverse weather or loss condition until additional feed becomes available. Okay, we also have some assistance to transport water. So with this one, you have to have a risk in both the eligible livestock as well as the eligible grazing land. You must be transporting water to eligible livestock that is on eligible grazing land. You must have had adequate livestock watering systems or facilities prior to the adverse weather event occurring and not normally be required to transport water to those livestock. Payments are for costs associated with water transport, equipment fees, labor, and contracted water transportation fees. This does not include the cost of the water itself. Our payment formula will use a national average price per gallon to transport water plus other factors. Okay, let's talk about the Livestock Indemnity Program, or LIP. So this one's going to provide financial assistance for livestock losses above normal mortality that are due to a qualified disaster event. So this would include flooding, blizzards, winter storms, extreme heat, and extreme cold, among others. USDA sets a national payment rate per head based on 75% of average fair market value. The next slide is going to show the 2024 rates. I actually got 2025 rates this afternoon, but did not have time to put them into the presentation. Documentations of losses and beginning inventories is critical to this program. So you need to be making sure that you've maintained good records. Feedlot livestock are eligible for this program. There's some eligibility criteria there as well. Once again, the deadline is March 1st of the following year. Okay, so this is the 2024 LIP payment rates. And so I will just give, let's take a look at cows. So that rate for 25 is going to be $1,810.09. And then let's say if we took non-adult 400 to 799 pounds, that would be $1,133.82. So if you have more questions on that, please contact your local office and they will be able to provide you with the full 2025 rates on those. Okay, we also have the Emergency Conservation Program, or ECP. This is a cost share program to assist producers through reimbursement of expenses associated with land rehabilitation. So for drought, that means we can look at programs to provide emergency water for livestock in confinement operations and provide water conservation and enhancements for grazing livestock. This program is triggered at the county level based on FSA County Committee assessments of disaster and need. We do require cultural and environmental consultations to be completed with this program. We can cover up to 75% of the allowable cost to implement the approved practice. A limited resource or beginning or underserved producer can receive 90% cost share. And this is limited to $500,000 per person or legal entity per disaster. Producers who want to access this cost share program need to contact their FSA office prior to taking any actions or repairs to their property. We cannot retroactively reimburse expenses. Another thing that we have available is CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, emergency haying and grazing. So emergency haying or grazing of CRP cover is allowed on all practices outside of the primary nesting season. Our primary nesting season in Nebraska is May 1st to July 15th. And so we can get into those situations when all or part of the county is designated D2 on the drought monitor. We've got a 40% loss in forage production in the county where the CRP is physically located, or USDA determines that CRP can assist in response to a natural disaster event without long-term damage to that established cover. Biggest takeaway here is there's paperwork involved with this. You need to contact your local FSA office and make sure all of that is in place prior to moving forward with haying or grazing of any CRP. Okay, next I want to talk about NAP, our non-insured crop disaster assistance program. Technically, we consider this a safety net program. However, it does function very much like a disaster program. So NAP provides financial assistance to producers for certain eligible crops for which there is no commercially available risk protection insurance. So this can assist with low yields, loss of inventory, or preventive planning due to eligible disasters such as drought, freeze, hail, excessive moisture, and others. Generally, this is going to cover specialty crops such as vegetables, fruits, but also grass, alfalfa, triticale, rye, and others when that commercial insurance is not available. With this, you can have NAP on your grass as well as have PRF coverage through traditional crop insurance. So this is going to cover crop losses in excess of 50% at a 55% level of the average market price for the crop. We can buy up that coverage on everything except grazing crops. Service fee is the lesser of $325 per crop, or $825 per producer per administrative county, not to exceed a total of $1,950 for a producer with farming interests in multiple counties. Beginning farmers as well as socially disadvantaged producers, we will waive the service fee and provide a 50% reduction in the buy-up coverage. Applications for coverage vary by crop. Please stay in touch with your local FSA office. But for example, if you would like grass coverage for 2026, the application deadline is November 17th of 2025. So you do need to plan ahead to take advantage of this. I want to briefly mention disaster designation process. We have been receiving some questions on this. And while many key FSA drought disaster programs trigger off of the U.S. Drought Monitor, FSA emergency loans actually trigger off of disaster designations. These designations may also come into play for folks selling livestock due to drought and looking at the tax implications of those sales. The Secretary of Ag is authorized to designate counties as disaster areas to make emergency loans available to producers suffering losses in those counties and contiguous counties. So there's 4 types of disaster designations here. We're mostly going to focus on secretarial disaster designations. So these must be requested of the Secretary of Ag by a governor or their representative, an Indian Tribal Council leader, or an FSA state executive director. This is the most widely used of the disaster designations. A county must have a 30% production loss of at least one crop, or a determination must be made by surveying area commercial lenders regarding whether they would be able to provide emergency financing to producers. I do want to note that there is a fast track disaster designation that does trigger off of the drought monitor. So if any portion of the county meets D2 severe drought intensity for 8 consecutive weeks, or a higher drought intensity for any time, that's when we start triggering these fast track disaster designations. So this is not the most current map, as we did add additional counties, got notification last night. So in addition to Kimball and Cheyenne showing on this map as contiguous, primary drought disaster designations have been received for Banner, Box Butte, Cherry, Dawes, Scottsbluff, Sheridan, and Sioux. And that means every bordering county has received a contiguous drought disaster designation, and those counties are listed here. Okay, communication tools. Farmers.gov is a great source of information. You can also go to fsa.usda.gov. And then this bottom one has a /NE for the Nebraska State FSA webpage. Communication tools. This is Gov Delivery. Hopefully many of you are already subscribed to receive this. If you are, please take the time to review this, as we do try to send out really important information through this. If you don't know if you're subscribed, contact your local office and they can help get that set up for you. Each county issues a monthly Gov Delivery, and then the state also issues one monthly. And then just wanted to close with, here's how you can find the contact information for your local service center, and those folks are there and ready to assist you and will be your best source of information. So I would take any questions if there are any.
Well, let me get it in front.
Laura, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Dan Barrett. I have not so much a question as a comment. I see all these services available for producers. What are we doing for the landowners to keep them in business so they can rent pasture to that guy next year?
Dan, most of these programs are going to be driven off of the need to have that eligible livestock as well. That's just really what drives most of these, is there has to be that eligible livestock component as well. I just had a question here in the room if we qualified today. The drought monitor won't be released until Thursday, and then that will come back and cover starting today. So the drought monitor on Thursday will make that determination on whether LFP has been triggered for a county.
There's been concern about the drought monitor not registering properly in some of our areas. Like, is there any workaround with that?
LFP is solely triggered off of the drought monitor.
Went through it really fast. Oh, Laura, on the disaster designation page where like Kimball is in the contiguous drought disaster designation, what does that mean? Just can you explain that quickly? As far as what does that put us in for qualifying for things?
Okay, so that would allow you to access FSA emergency loans. And so the best source of contact with that would be to get a hold of your local FSA office that does handle loans, and they can walk you through that process. And then the other thing would potentially be to visit with your accountant on how that can impact your tax situation if you are required to sell off cattle. Because that does trigger some additional provisions regarding deferring, I believe deferring that income, or you have a set amount of time to buy livestock back to mitigate those capital gains.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So your map doesn't show Goshen County, at least currently. Do you?
No,
That's listed or not? Or
it should be, because Banner triggered as a primary, so Goshen County would then be contiguous. Like I said, we got notified late last night that we had, or late yesterday afternoon, that we had additional counties designated as primary counties, but we didn't have a map reflecting that to add on here today.
The reason I ask, I know there are some ranchers over in that area that are tuned in.
Okay, yep. So any county that borders one of those primary disaster counties will have a contiguous drought designation as well.
So Laura, a question came in. Does this, as we think about loss and compensation for grazing cattle, do yearling cattle qualify, or is that cow calf only?
Yes, yearling would qualify, but it is going to depend on the situation of the producer, whether those are owned cattle or taken cattle, as well as purchase dates. So that's a fairly broad question. So I am going to ask that you contact your local FSA office to work through the specifics of that with your operation.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, so if the disaster declaration is made, how soon can we start applying for assistance?
So if you are, so that disaster designation opens up those emergency loans. So you could get in contact with your local FSA office to put you in touch with the farm loan team to discuss what that looks like. As far as LFP, livestock forage, if your county triggers D3 this week on the drought monitor, we can start taking applications. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so as soon as it triggers, we can apply.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, if there's no more questions, I guess I'll turn it back over to Aaron.
All right, any other questions for Laura before we point towards wrapping up? All right, well, we really do appreciate you joining us tonight. We do have a brief evaluation that I'm going to put in the chat box. And so if you're watching online, if you'd be willing to take a few minutes to fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. That just helps us know how we did, what was good, what could have been better, the value you got out of that. Also, I did record this tonight, and so we will send that recording out tomorrow. So for those of you who'd like to go back and review some of the content, you'll be able to do that. And I know there's a number of folks who signed up who will be watching the recording. As was mentioned earlier, we are here to be a resource as you evaluate your different situations you're dealing with, whether it's looking at putting together a ration or evaluating stocking on pasture. Please reach out to us. And of course, as Laura said, she provided that information based on your local FSA office. As you have questions around drought programs, make sure you visit with your local FSA office. So with that, I guess anything from the group before we sign off tonight? Okay, again, thanks for joining us, and we'll be sending that information out to you.